Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this session on privacy and mobile applications. Before we start this session, I just want to make some housekeeping announcements. I would request all the participants to keep their mics muted and during the session on the chat box and directed towards the host. We will take them up in the question and answer session or in the middle of the conversation if relevant. I would also want to indicate that this session is being live streamed on YouTube. We will also be tweeting about this session with hashtags of privacy and mobile applications and safer internet day and technology and society. I would request all of the participants to please use these hashtags if they on Twitter. And now I will hand it to Amol for opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shubhangi. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good evening, depending on from where you are joining. And welcome to the webinar on privacy in mobile applications. I am Amol Kulkarni, and I am Director Research at CUTS International. I'll just give some brief opening remarks before we hand over the conversation to Deepak and Shivangi, who is our guest speaker for the day. So in 2017, the Supreme Court of India recognized privacy as a fundamental right. This resulted in government's attempt to enact a personal data protection bill, which is currently under consideration by the Joint Parliamentary Committee. The last few years, as a result, has witnessed phenomenal growth in digital economy, which is expected to create a value of up to 1 trillion US dollars by 2025. A recent report also suggests that this phenomenal growth of digital economy is fueled by smartphone users of India. Incidentally, the worldwide smartphone users surpassed 3 billion mark and are racing towards the 4 billion mark, of which the most growth is contributed by China, India, and United States, with India contributing to about 500 million smartphone users. Phones have now doubled up as education tools, banks, and even supermarkets. India has emerged as one of the top five gaming economies, with tier two cities like Ahmedabad ruling the roast, and before before cities like Bombay and Delhi. We are also using smartphones for social media and OTT video streaming services. At the same time, there have been concerns around data collection and usage practices of service providers. Limited awareness exists amongst consumers about privacy risks and the steps which they can take to mitigate such risks. While consumers are required to provide consent to privacy policies, we have found that challenges with respect to length, legalese, and language have inhibited informed consent amongst consumers. It is increasingly becoming important to talk about these issues, and there is no better time than Safer Internet Day 2021, which is being celebrated today to promote safe use of digital technology, particularly among new users, with the theme of Together for a Better Internet. And I'm glad to say that we have perfect people to have this conversation. We have Deepak Maheshwari, distinguished fellow at CUTS and is industry veteran, cybersecurity expert to speak on these issues with Shivangi Natkarni, another industry veteran and co-founder of ARCA. This is just the first conversation in the series of conversations that we will be hosting in the next few months under the theme of technology and society. And these conversations would be moderated by Deepak, and he will speak with several industry veterans and stakeholders in the technology and policy space. In today's conversation, we are particularly looking to answer or discuss three key issues. What are the privacy issues associated with mobile applications and website? What are the current upheavals related to privacy in global digital ecosystems, and how do they affect consumers? What are the reforms which are required to address these issues, and what could consumers do? What are the practical steps which consumers can take to protect their privacy. With these brief remarks, I would like to invite Deepak to take forward this conversation by introducing our guest speaker for the day. Thank you very much, and over to you, Deepak.
Thanks, Amol. And let me just add to Amol's and Shubhangi's welcome on behalf of Kurtz to all the participants and also to Shivangi, our guest today. So when we are looking at something like safer internet today, I'm remember like uh, more than 2 decades back when the government announced the internet policy, I filed a petition against that in less than 24 hours, and we got much better policy, I would say, in 1998, thanks to that type of endeavors. And that time we were looking at something like 1 to 2 million internet customers, and that was the government's policy objective at that time when it was announced in 1998. Now, today, when almost half of the population is already online, and we are also looking at the next half billion coming online in the next few years, what's happening is that earlier people who had a PC, I mean, Shivangi and I were colleagues and we were working in India's first private ISP called SIFI. And SIFI and several other ISPs at that point of time, people would go and sell internet connections to the people, to users who already had a PC. So that was our first filter that, okay, somebody had a PC, go sell internet connection to them. I think few years later it changed. People started buying PC because they wanted to get connected to internet. And today, when we are looking at the ads or anything like that, if we see in terms of mobile phones, hardly any mobile phone today talks about, okay, that the voice clarity is very good. I mean, that's what the mobile phone, okay, or you can talk while you are walking. So people do talk a lot about the camera or the storage or the memory or for that matter, the connectivity and things like that. And all of that is basically driven by this whole spurt in the multimedia content, which people are not only consuming, but increasingly are also producing and sharing. And this whole phenomenon about producing as well as consuming was something that the futurist Alvin Toffler had mentioned in his book several decades back. And he would call these people as prosumers. That was the term that he used. And today, when we are looking at these type of issues, one major concern, as Amol just mentioned, was around privacy. Of course, some of us have been looking into this issue around privacy, not just in terms of legislation, but also in terms of the technology and also in terms of the company policies, etc., for much longer. This is something which is coming up front and center all over the world. And I'll say that there were two or three major triggers around it. So one was, of course, the implementation of enforcement of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, which came into force on 25th of May 2018. And that was one, I'll say, a major point of reckoning for people. And of course, within the country, as Amol just mentioned, we had this case in August 2017 when the Supreme Court of India did mention about the privacy. They upheld privacy as a fundamental right. But beyond all these things, we also have seen that the consumers are also taking up internet services, especially through mobile phones in a big way. And in the past 14, 15 years, we have seen the upsurge of new operating systems like iOS as well as Android, and millions of new mobile apps that have there in these stores, plus also the third-party apps, etc. Now, in this context, when we are looking at the Safer Internet Day, and when I'm talking about Safer Internet Day, obviously we do not want to uh, mention or convey that safety on the internet is only about privacy. There are many other things also, okay? But privacy is one of the most important and fundamental things. And today's discussion is going to be focused more around privacy. So, Shivangi, ARCA has been also doing this study, which I think started also around 2016-17, around that point of time. That's when also it so happens that the Supreme Court judgment came. And over the years, one of the trends that I've seen in these studies is that the number of I mean, of course, you do have this privacy index as a score 52 out of 100 in the latest study. But beyond that, when we start unpeeling the onion, we also see certain other interesting things. So one is the amount of the number of apps that ask for certain type of privacy sensitive permissions, that's something which we have seen keep on rising over the years. So that's one specific trend that I observed in these. So want to understand with you, not just in terms of mobile apps, but also because many of us are using websites as well, and websites do have something called cookies apart from other trackers. So what are these issues related to privacy that people should be looking in terms of both the mobile apps, but also a little bit around websites?
Okay, thanks, Deepak. I think I think I'm going to take one step back before I answer your question directly. What you rightly pointed out was that there is much more to say for internet than just privacy, and so there is also the whole security aspect. And so today we are not going to be focusing on, let's say, how do I protect the data that is there on my phone, or all of that, but rather on privacy, which is all about how do you ensure some semblance of control over your own data. That's what the whole deal is about, right? And therefore, when we are online, and most of us with a mobile phone are online 24 by 7, with all the apps loaded, a lot of us don't realize that below the surface a lot of information is getting sucked out and shared with the outside world, right? And similarly with the web. Now, you and I go back a long way. We've seen that the web is a very mature ecosystem. We've been seeing web browsers and servers for so many years. Therefore, the whole tracking and you know the ability to extract data from a website, by a website, is far more sophisticated and mature than the mobile ecosystem. So there are two things that have happened in the last decade or so. One is that the technology is available to extract data from your devices, whether it is a mobile phone, whether it's a laptop, or any other smart device, actually has monumentally exploded and gone up, and in terms of sophistication. The second is the whole backend ecosystem, right? Which is a ecosystem of which is largely known as ad tech, but basically, essentially, people who are advertisers, publishers, data brokers. The whole, how do you, for example, you let's say you search for a particular book, and how is it that in real time almost you start seeing ads for that book? The reason is there is this whole sophisticated ecosystem at the back end with real time bidding and stuff like that. So these both of them having risen and become so much more sophisticated and capable is where these permissions become critical. So it's important to understand that it's one is about, of course, extracting data and how it gets processed at the back end, and which most of us are not aware of. So what we can study, and what we have studied in our study for the last 4 years, is let's just take a look at how much of data is getting extracted, because then based on that, all this is being shared into the under the hood kind of stuff, right? And therefore these things become critical, because most people are not aware. Most people think that, okay, if I have to protect my phone, I have to make sure there are no virus. That's the average consumers insight. Whereas most of them don't realize that with every permission that you give, the amount of data that gets extracted and shared further is tremendous. And you have to remember that if you have, let's say, ABC app, the ABC app uses certain permissions. As you pointed out, some of them are dangerous permissions, so they actually are called out in your phone itself. So if you see, you can go in individual permissions like location, camera, microphone, contacts, calendar, all of that you can actually see, and switch them off manually, right? Apart from that, of course, there's a lot of permission. Now, each of them enables the app to extract data about you, or to do activities like, if they have access to microphone, they can record what is going on. If they have access to camera, they can actually take pictures or videos, so stuff like that, right? Now, apart from ABC app also has what are called SDKs or third-party codes that are embedded in the app, which belong to third parties. It is for legitimate purposes. So I'm not talking about malicious ones. Okay, so legitimate purposes because they offer certain functionalities and features. Now, whatever data comes via these permissions not only goes to ABC, but it goes to all those app providers whose SDKs are embedded. And now each of them then flushes it out into that, abyss. So you really have no control. The only thing as individuals we can control is to, reduce the number of permissions we give on our phones, or when you're on the web, of course, look at more than permissions, there are other kinds of cookies and trackers. So that's really the state of the ecosystem today.
In fact, I would also add to that that one of the other things could be, I mean, right now we have this, so the government of India has started this thing, this fortnight from 1st of February, it's called Swachhata Pakhwala, the cleanliness fortnight, of course, from a
Mhm.
different ministry, but perhaps one of the ways, and right now we are bang in the middle of this particular sort of spring cleaning fortnight in a way, could also be in terms of, let's say, looking at our phones and just see what all apps we have got there. So maybe there are apps which we haven't even used even once. Maybe there are apps which we haven't used for years or months, or maybe some app that we would have used at some particular point of time for some particular reason. And unfortunately, after that, we haven't even bothered to remove that. And because of the huge memory available today in the phones, most of the time people are not really bothered to clean up this side, that okay, there's an app, and if I'm not using, why should it still reside? Because at times, even while you're not using that particular app per se, that app keeps on sending some information anyway. And second thing is, every time it gets updated and refreshed, obviously again there's a certain level of information exchange. And thirdly, this is again something that could lead to additional permissions being granted, not initially when you install that app, but maybe subsequently because of some particular update has come. So for example, if you have a, let's say, a conferencing app without a video, initially it could be just about your uh, contacts and the calendar and microphone. But if they add a video functionality, obviously they would need access to the camera also, and it might happening by default. So one question that I want to ask you at this stage is this: how important are the default settings in these apps? Because every app comes with certain default settings, and so yes, I can go there and sort of remove location or etc etc, but most of the time people are loath to even look at what all permissions are there by default. So how important are these default permissions in terms vis-a-vis the functionality of that particular app?
Great question. I think, at least in India, at least I haven't seen I don't know about iOS because we haven't checked, but Android for sure, default most, unless it's a very responsible app developer, right? So the big guys, you can assume, will put default as not taking certain settings. But by far, most people by default take all the permissions that are built into the app. So if the app is built to take, let's say, location permission, then by default it will take that. So you have to go and manually check and make sure that it is off. There's an option in, for example, iOS, and Android is also building that, which is called a just in time permission, which means that, the permission gets switched on only when it's required. Like, let's say a taxi hailing app, when only when you are actually hailing the looking for a cab will it switch on the location, and otherwise switch off. But there are lots of apps which use this permission. Now this is being driven by iOS, but the lots of app, what we found in our study is that the moment you switch on the first time, it remains on, it doesn't go off, right? That's point number one. Point number two is that a lot of apps, even if you go and manually switch off, and it takes you like 30 seconds to do it, it's not a very big deal, right? When the app gets upgraded, like you just mentioned, we found that most of the times the permissions get reset and they come on. So you have to go back and do it. It's a good thing. I think that spring clean thing is a wonderful idea. I keep advising people to, first of all, don't install apps you don't need. You can always reinstall it, if you're going to need it maybe after 3 months. And it's good idea to go once in a while and remove the apps you don't use.
Yeah, and I think it will help at least in two ways. Maybe it will free up some memory to have more of photographs and videos, etc. And secondly, it will also reduce at least some of the bandwidth consumption that we have. So because at times we think that okay, data connection is not great because we are focusing only on the, let's say, watching a particular movie or doing a particular, let's say, this particular conference. But even right now, there could be multiple other things which are on the same network, and all of them do clog up the same highways in a way. So the other thing I want to sort of move the discussion towards was how are, so recently we have seen some major changes announced by some companies, especially in the messaging space. So obviously there's an issue related to, let's say, end-to-end encryption, which is basically, I won't call it, yes, it's important for privacy also, but it's also more beyond privacy. I would say it's also about confidentiality of the messages itself. So it's about the not the privacy of the person so much, but more importantly, the privacy of the message, the confidentiality of the message, and the integrity of the message. So some of these things that we have seen, and then we have also seen exhausters of whole lot of groups and some users from one platform to another platform, although different platforms sort of all of them claim that they are using the similar type of end-to-end encryption using the same protocol. So what is it that is driving this whole behavior, and what are the repercussions for people to both in terms of users, but also I would say in terms of policymakers to start looking into this area of privacy?
Good. I think there was a lot of debate and discussion around this whole messaging app that you just mentioned, right? I think, and I've talked about this in other public forums as well, is I think people were getting wound up about things without knowing the full picture. So I think the company has assured people that they will continue to not look at the content of the app. So the confidentiality of the message is going to continue to remain confidential, and with end-to-end encryption happening, what is going to happen is that the surrounding meta information, which is metadata, most people here are tech people, so it is basically the how, when, how, where, etc., about the information, which as we all know is actually probably far more important than the actual content of the message, because that gives a whole lot of information. I mean, if I'm calling you 3 times a day, vis-a-vis calling somebody once in 3 months, it just establishes a different kind of, gives a different signal about us being having a certain kind of rapport, whatever. So it helps establish a whole bunch of downstream parameters, and which is what the buyers, advertisers and other stakeholders are interested in. They're trying to profile you and build your personality, right? So these are the things that contribute. So one should not trivialize the importance of metadata. Sometimes we get carried away by, is my content confidential? It is going to be confidential, but remember the rest. Now the question about the rest is whether you have one group on the app or you have multiple groups on the app. As long as the app is running, the same amount of data gets leaked out, right? I mean, not even leaked, it gets out legitimately. It's not even illegal. So unless you're willing to migrate completely out of the app and the family of apps, right, you're not going to really gain anything. So it was ridiculous to see people saying, okay, I'm moving to this app, but then they continue using this app also. So somewhere I think there was a lot of misinformation that went out at that time.
Okay, that's interesting, because one of the important things that I observed in this whole scenario was this. I mean, there's some apps where, for example, I mean, it seems very ridiculous for a particular app to have that type of access. Okay, so for example, if there's a searchlight and that searchlight or a torch app also has access to contacts, I mean, that seems quite odd. At the same time, maybe an app. But the other thing that we have observed off late is something else. And this again something I observed, that in your report you have talked about health apps, super apps, fintech, and several others. So within this fintech, especially when we are talking about more than 2 billion UPI transactions itself per month, apart from many other, of course, in the country right now, a lot of people are making mobile payments, and which is a good thing, I would say. Uh, I mean, yes, there were two specific reasons as a major triggers. One was demonetization in 2016 November, and of course, the lockdown started 11 months back. But the second thing that we have observed is also this, that earlier we would go for the second factor authentication, which RBI started more than a decade back for all card not present transactions, which was a great thing. That, okay, for every transaction you would get an OTP or some other form of authentication, and typically OTP, and that was something which was coming through a different channel, and then you would put in that on a website and do the transaction. Today what's happening is most of the people are using mobile as the default device, because more than 90% people in India who are using internet are using definitely on mobile. And even many of us who are using not just mobile but also on laptops and other devices are also increasingly relying more and more on the mobile device itself for internet connectivity. So when people are doing these transactions on mobile phones, what's happening is the OTP is also coming on the mobile, on the same screen. So one way is you toggle across, you go to your messaging app, see the 6-digit OTP, either note it down somewhere or memorize, and then enter it, open a different screen. Or an easy way out, or an but a dangerous way in, is to let your fintech apps or the transaction apps itself read this this SMS, that so you allow the text messages access to them, and they'll just go read out these and then fill it up, autofill, and then you are done. Voila. So what's your take on these type of things? Like, what is a good way for people to manage this? And is it really necessary for us to have OTP necessarily for each and every transaction? Or maybe as a user, or the regulator should allow that, okay, such and such type of, maybe up to 100 rupees or up to whatever amount that individuals or individual companies may decide, that okay, up to this OTP may not be necessary, and so that you can take care of both this type of privacy, but also in terms of risks.
Okay. So there are multiple questions within your question, right?
Yeah.
Or multiple issues. So one issue is whether OTP is the best mechanism or not. And I think we should not dwell into that, because that's a huge area by itself. There are several alternatives to OTP, and whether or not it's the right or wrong thing, I think we should let experts on that debate. Coming to the implications of that on on apps and as an individual, sure, I mean, I get it. It is painful to have to memorize and stuff like that. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. Each of us as individuals have different risk profiles, and we have different so let's assume somebody is doing multiple transactions a day, right? For them, it is a inconvenience if they, for 10 times, they're going to be having to remember and key in OTP. But maybe somebody is doing 1 in 10 days, so it's no big deal, right? Even then, the person who's doing 10 transactions a day may still be very, very particular about not giving his app access to his SMS, and may therefore insist on noting down or finding out, memorizing it or whatever, and using it. I think what I'm driving to is to say that there is no right or wrong answer. It depends on individuals' preferences. But more importantly, and that's where privacy pivots around, is the fact that you have to give the choice to the user. What happens today is a lot of times this choice is taken away, either by default settings, which just by default will let SMS come in, or sometimes not even giving an option to change the default settings, right? And that's where all the problem starts. We are, all of us are individuals, we have a right to decide what we want to do, but somebody else deciding it for us and controlling is where the problem is.
Okay. So the other thing I noticed in your report is, and by the way, some of the audience have asked us which particular report I am talking about. So this is a report which has been published for past 4 years by Arka, where Shivangi is the co-founder and CEO. So they do this report about the security and privacy of mobile apps and websites in India. So that's a report which normally they publish every year in December. And what we shall do is from Kurtz, we shall include a link to that particular report to all the people who are attending or who have registered for this workshop. So now in the report, I also noticed that you have a term called super apps. Okay. And also you have this whole thing around dangerous permissions, which you mentioned earlier, that okay, camera, microphone, etc. And sometimes I wonder that although on one hand one would think that camera is a little more obtrusive and intrusive intervention compared to microphone, but on the other hand I find this, that when the camera is on, at least there's something which is visible on the screen, that okay, the camera is on in most of the cases. Whereas when the microphone is on, there's no visible, perceptible thing that the microphone is actually on. So I find that switching on the microphone at the back end by somebody is perhaps even more dangerous, uh, or at least equally as dangerous as the camera itself. But what is a super app and why should we bother about super apps per se? That's one. And second is, increasingly what we have also observed, that a lot of people end up at third party play stores, app stores. Okay, so of course there's a Google Play store, and of course there would be an store of the OEM from whom you have taken the device. These two are, I'll say, by default anyway available on any Android device. But beyond that, there are many other third party stores, and a lot of times people land up there unwittingly, unconsciously, or just out of sheer ignorance. Somebody sent a link that okay, this here is a great app, they just land up there. And at times they get not just a dangerous app, at times they actually land up in an app which could be a lookalike, so it's almost like a phishing or any such other thing.
Yeah.
So how should people look at that, these aspects? So what is the super app and the third party apps,
Okay.
app stores, not third party apps, third party app
App
stores?
stores, right? So super apps are like any other apps. Like you have fintech, you have banking, you have certain categories of apps which are called super apps because they end up doing multiple things. Like messaging, come shopping, come multiple things bundled into one. So
Good,
the
yes.
industry calls them super apps.
Okay.
Okay, they're just like any other app
Okay.
essentially.
All right.
Third parties, yes, I really third party stores is worrisome, and I've seen this also, as I'm sure you have, which is people land up there, and you have huge risks because, as you said, you can download malicious apps and whatnot. So I think as a policy, nobody should ever download an app which is not from an authorized store. Like, either stick to uh, if you're on Android, stick to the Google Play Store. If you're on iOS, stick to the Apple Store. And of course, your OEM, whoever you've purchased the app from, just them. Don't download apps from anywhere else, not even a corporate website. And good corporate websites actually never put the app up. They only give a link to the Play Store or the App Store.
I
So
think this
they're
is a
also
very
responsible.
important insight that you're sharing, because as a user, people should be aware of this. The
Yeah.
other aspect was in your report deals with children, and India with a huge population of children. I mean, almost huge hundreds of millions of children, and in the last 1 year itself, we have seen so many of them having to sort of move on to online studies, not so much by choice, but by compulsion,
Yeah.
and sharing these devices and services within the family or in the community. But when we are looking at these apps which are specifically targeting children, so whether it is an edtech app or for that matter, many others, they could be even entertainment apps and others. What are the other type of challenges that children in particular, or for that matter, their parents or guardians or teachers and other elders should be careful about? That was one related to children specifically.
Yeah. So in India, we don't have any law or regulation that specifically looks at children's data per se. And the good news is that at least the version of the personal data protection bill that went to parliament last year had a specific section calling out children, and a whole bunch of clauses around that, which is a good thing. And because there is an absence of this, there is actually nobody regulating or laying down norms for children's apps, right? And which is why they do exactly what they want to do or use the functionality. I like to believe that a lot of people do what they do out of ignorance more than anything else, right? And so in the process, what happens is the same rules that are happening for adults are happening with kids, which means that you have dangerous permissions. For example, we've noticed that there's at least one dangerous permission present in the children's apps from India. Or for example, they may be taking access to camera or microphone or location. They allow in-app purchases. So 57% of apps in India, children's apps, actually allow in-app purchases, which means, I mean, think for a moment, it's your phone and your child with your credit card, let's say, fed in, and your child is actually playing around with an app and can actually go out and purchase whatever they want, you know so in-app purchases are risky. Ads which are age inappropriate, so if you're a 8-year-old child and you're beginning to see ads which are for adults, that's also a highly risky behavior. So I think all of this needs to be regulated, and let's wait and hope that the new bill will seek to regulate that. Maybe the industry should come together and think of something that can meanwhile regulate children's apps, because you're right, and it worries me tremendously that so many kids are online today, and as you said, forced to be online, and most of them are super smart, so they know how to operate a device far better than their parents very often, and yet they're not aware of a lot of this. So I think we have a long challenge, a long fight ahead over there.
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference between a child lock in a car is, and for that matter, in a TV or an app, is that in a car usually it's the adult who will be operating the child lock, whereas in a TV or on a phone or a computer, typically maybe the parents themselves ask the children, okay, where's the child lock, and the children may or may not even be forthcoming to help them out, or even if they help them out once, they might reset the password for that particular access and rather keep the control with them. So when we are looking at the PDP bill itself, you mentioned about that. And in the PDP bill now, we are looking at this whole scenario that, okay, and apart from PDP bill, there have been other propositions that there's a data enhancement and empowerment layer, and many other type of things are also being proposed from different bodies within the government and even outside there. So as users, obviously people are getting, I'll say, uh, I mean, at times there's just too much of data around this, but also we are seeing something else at this point of time. And that is that people are looking at privacy itself as the only thing to bother about at times. Uh, and what are the other things apart from privacy? I know that today's discussion is mostly around privacy, but I do want to use this occasion that you did mention, for example, safety is one aspect, but also there could be things like, let's say, uh, excessive use of the screens itself in terms of the sheer usage, and certain other aspects. So, for example, right now we are on Zoom, and I mean, Zoom was, I'll say, practically unknown to many people till about a year back, and today it's become almost like a verb. But at the same time, last year we did see this whole thing about Zoom bombing and many other things. So, for example, when we are using an app like Zoom, and I'm talking about Zoom just as an example, there could be a whole lot of other apps, both from India and globally on web conferencing. What are the type of things that people should look at while using these apps in terms of privacy itself?
Well, I think we should, one, of course, the whole thing about permissions, about trackers, which we have no idea about. And we will actually never know where is data being shared, which are the SDKs embedded. That's what an average user doesn't know unless you sort of deep dive into terms and conditions, which none of us do, right? Other than that, of course, you have to worry about the security all the time, right? Don't download malicious apps. Do not click on every forward that you get on WhatsApp. Be careful about what you open, what you download. I mean, these are basic hygiene things that we've all sort of grown up with. But I think no matter how often you sort of reiterate this message, it's never enough, because the same mistakes get kept being made all the time, right? So that is definitely one. Second, I think the other kind of challenges, like you said, too much of screen time, or problems about the phone heating up, not charging. That's another aspect. And then things about how do you back up data. If in critical data needs to be backed up at all times, because you just assume that at some point in time you will lose data. So having a backup instead of having an oops moment if it happens, that's another thing. And then basic things, basically ensure you have backups. Remember that whatever goes online is permanent. There is a copy maintained somewhere. Don't think that just because you erase it from your device or your laptop it is gone. So these are some things which we need to keep in mind. And I think those of us who are from the industry have to go on and on and on educating. It's never enough. So it's like it's a bit like how the health industry operates. Even after so many years people are still learning about stuff. So I think that's how it is going to be the coming era. Just that I don't think we have the luxury of time, because this whole space, as you mentioned the numbers at the beginning of this chat, with the skyrocketing, right? So the risks are also exploding proportionately, and so we don't have the luxury of time to sort of wait and let it slowly develop. We have to make sure that our users come up to speed very quickly as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for last 1 year, people are talking about this whole thing around, of course, mask, social distancing, and etc., and of course now inoculation. But for past several years, I've been giving this analogy about from health and privacy and security. Basically, if we take, so what WHO has been telling us for decades now is this, that if we take care of pre and postnatal vaccination, the basic vaccination, if we take care of basic hygiene, washing hands and having clean drinking water, etc., and also basic nutrition, it doesn't mean that things will not, something can't happen to us, or we will never get any disease or infection. But number one, the chances are less. Number two, even as and when something happens, the severity, the impact is likely to be less. And thirdly, the chances and the speed and efficiency of our recovery and resilience is going to be much higher. And I think that's something which amply and aptly applies even in the space of cybersecurity and privacy, especially in the past 1 year, as people have seen that, yes, I mean, you are using masks, you are maintaining social distancing, etc. Doesn't mean that you can't get infected, but still the chances are much lesser that way. And of course, now with vaccination, things should get improving further.
Right.
So another thing about privacy, a lot of times people see, especially when it comes to mobile apps, but it is equally true even on, I mean, it's not that on a mobile app, if I don't read a 63-page long privacy policy, it's not that when it's available on a 17-inch screen, I would read all that. So I think it applies in both these scenarios. So the other thing that a lot of people are proposing is some sort of labelings. Okay, so let's say nutrition labels. So not that every time you go to and buy something, you'll read how much, what is the calorie, what is the sugar, salt, etc. But at least some information is available if you are willing to look at that information. So how much valuable that type of thing would be to enhance privacy? So one thing is to tell people that, okay, look for these type of things, but also should these apps, all apart from, of course, I think they'll continue to have these longer and longer privacy policies because of legislations, but at the same time also give at least some indication about, okay, these are the type of things that we are collecting, or whether we have access to your Wi-Fi, you can switch on Wi-Fi, not many other things. So what's your take on this? That's one of the questions, by the way, from audience. Okay.
Okay. Oh, the nutrition label thing, the app nutrition label, as Apple is calling it, is, in my opinion, a game changer. It's going to change, it's going to open people's eyes, because, one thing is hearing discussions like these. Other is to see clearly that, hey, this is the kind of data that's being picked up about me, right? So I think it'll also push app publishers, which is, the guys who are developing the apps, to also become more responsible, because when they know that consumers are going to know this and there's going to be a backlash, and this recent whole thing around the messaging controversy shows how effective a consumer awareness can happen. I think it's going to make a lot of difference. So I look at that very, very hopefully.
Okay.
Brilliant move by Apple.
So, yeah, I mean, so this is something which I remember. Hugh Thompson, who used to be CTO of Symantec a few years back at the RSA conference, he actually came up with this proposition. Uh, I think about 3 or 4 years back on this whole thing around these labelings, like nutrition labels type of thing, and of course many others have also talked about it. So the other aspect around privacy I wanted to touch upon again, I would say, which you did mention long back in this discussion, was around metadata. And metadata, to put it simply for the audience, it's data about data. So for example, let's say if I'm sending a particular communication, or we are talking right now, so this is one type of data. But the fact that, okay, this is coming from a particular device, what is the MAC ID of that device, or what is the IP address, what is the date, time, location, and many other things. So all of that forms metadata. And we have this report about 5 weeks back from the non-personal data committee of experts. And they did talk about this whole concept around community privacy, community rights, etc. And I do not want to get into this whole discussion around whether that is pragmatic or not in terms of at a community level. But at the same time, I do want to know your views in terms of as individual. So what are the likely tensions between an individual privacy and a community privacy? So that was one. And second is, what are the one or two major scenarios of community privacy that people should uh, be concerned about?
Okay, I don't think there are tensions between personal privacy and community privacy. In fact, they are in tandem rather, right?
Okay.
So, community privacy is looking at what is non-personal data, which is data that cannot be attributed to you. So, for example, vehicle data given out by vehicles, given out by smart devices, let's say within a particular location. Oh, okay. So not all of it is personal data, but a lot of it is non-personal data, but it belongs to that location, that community, that car or that bus or whatever. It belongs to the public. And that's what the whole bill is about. So I view it as one continuum, which is that, you have personal and then you have the community. And, it is perfectly justified, whatever is, we won't, as I said, won't get into it, but I don't see any tensions from that. That's point number one. And second point is that, this is therefore any kind of protection and any kind of rights around community data are equally important, because today there is no answer. Who picks up vehicle movement data, and who does it belong to? If it is happening around a particular locality in Bombay, in, let's say, Dadar, should that belong to a company that's sitting in California, or should it belong to the municipality or that ward of the municipality and those people who should benefit? That's what the whole NPT debate is partially about, amongst other things. But I don't see a tension between personal and community data at all.
Okay. And what are the type of privacy concerns that could actually arise from so one is in terms of ownership or control or access, but what type of privacy concerns could actually arise at community level, not just at individual level?
So community data by definition is non-personal data,
Right.
right? So therefore, privacy is only about personal data. So the moment it is non-personal data, it moves out of the realm of privacy and it moves into other realms. So in this case, it is about, you know, protection around non-personal data, but it's not attributable to an individual. So we are not talking about privacy over there. So as such, technically, there's no sort of correlation. The risks that people are talking about, and rightfully so, is that some type of non-personal data is actually anonymized personal data that is going out there. So one, there may be something coming out of a street light, for example. Okay, that's going to be, to begin with, the data is non-personal. But some of it may be data that's, let's say, coming out of vehicle, where they anonymize and therefore you don't get to know the let's say the vehicle number, right? But if by sophisticated algorithms and computation techniques you're able to get that vehicle number, then it means that you're able to get the associated personal data associated with that anonymous data. And then what could therefore be the risks involved. But otherwise, they're two different domains.
So talking about these, let's say things you mentioned, for example, vehicles or something else. So now with the onset of 5G and IoT, Internet of Things, etc., and along with the massive advancements in the artificial intelligence domain itself, people are concerned a lot about sort of a recombinant usage of these type of different data sets, personal data, non-personal data, sensitive, and PII, SPI, etc. And that's again something which is sort of, I'll say, creating a concern around privacy, not because of individual data points per se, or individual companies or somebody else having that type of data, as you mentioned earlier, but by certain actors or certain other people whom we do not even know who they are or they could be, having this type of access and the ability to recombine many of these data points and then probably getting a lot to know things at times even we ourselves might not know.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what is the whole thing about AI, right? It'll throw up new learnings which we ourselves may not know types. Yeah, so there is, as you know, law is always catching up, playing catch up with technology, right? So technically, you will always have enhancements, and you will always run the risk of, people being identified from data which is supposed to be stripped of identity. And I think the only way, at least what I can think of, is sure there can be countermeasures, technical countermeasures, but they will be instituted only if there is a legal or a regulatory push. So, for example, in the earlier version, Justice Sri Krishna version of the bill, there was actually a criminal penalty associated with re-identification of data that they're not supposed to do. So that was, I mean, it gave a very strong deterrent to people to not do it, because the ability to do it will always be there, and therefore there have to be controls which are outside of that technology ecosystem, which will ensure that it doesn't happen.
Okay. So now that we are coming towards the end of this session, let me ask you, what are the 3 or 4 things that people should look at in terms of ensuring not just privacy on using, of course, apps on the mobile phones, but also in terms of their other usage. So, for example, at times people might be watching something on a OTT app on their the so-called smart TV, or using a smart fridge or a smart microwave oven, or what else. So, what are the other smart things that? So, rather than looking only at the smartness of the things, what are the smart thinking that people should do when they are indulging in these type of devices and sort of connecting कि हमारे घर में सब कुछ Wi-Fi से connected है, and that type of thing.
Yeah. So I think one thing that all of us have to remember is that anything that's smart is collecting data, and
Okay.
right? So find ways of minimizing how much of data can be collected. So one of the advice I like to give, or other suggestion, is that when you can, please switch off these devices. You have a smart speaker at home which is connected to everything. Switch it off at nights when you're sleeping. Switch it off when you're not at home. Don't keep it on at all times. It is sucking up data about the environment, right? Similarly with your smartphone TVs. I mean, there was a case 5 years ago where some smartphone, there was an app which was recording who is watching which this thing via the microphone, which channel you're watching, or which particular TV program you're watching. The phone was picking that up through smart sensors and sending it to a command and control center, and you're not even aware. You're just sitting there with the phone next to you. So stuff like that is happening. It's going to get even more sophisticated as we go along. So just be aware that anything smart means data. So that, I think that's enough to get all in smart people to figure out how to handle things.
So another question, and I would request you for a short response to that, which is that people are talking a lot about, let's say, these principles called privacy by design, security by design. So especially around privacy by design, um, I mean, so some company may claim that okay, we use privacy by design, and people may sort of believe that okay, fine. But what does this privacy by design actually mean, and how can users sort of be more sure about that? Okay, somebody who claims to be living by this whole principle called privacy by design is actually living up to those values and mm, basic underlying principles.
Okay. So
Law.
first of all, privacy by design or security by design essentially means that when a product or a service or a process is being designed, it is being designed keeping privacy in mind, right? So, for example, when you're filling up a form, you will not compel the user to give out info more than what is required, right? If you don't need it, don't take it. So minimize the data you collect. All the privacy principles are built into the design itself. There's a corollary to that called privacy by default, which means that your default setting is never on, it's always off, right? So stuff like that. Now, this what you see outside is a manifestation of what is being followed internally. Now, whether a company is really following that or not moves into the realm of assurance. And today, there aren't any real assurance mechanisms around to say whether, if somebody claims that they're doing that, is actually doing that. I'm sure down the line, the ecosystem will develop certification mechanisms, other means by which somebody comes and says that this is really being followed, or what our bill is talking about, which is to publish a privacy by design policy, which is actually at least forcing people to state something. Hopefully they will follow that. So I think it's very early stages for this, but I'm at least glad that people are talking about this, and lots of clients that we work with are actually seriously looking at you know getting help in terms of how to institute privacy by design into their ecosystem. So I think it's a good thing that's happening, and hopefully we will start seeing results in a while, depending on how it is. It's also not a very easy thing to do. It's very easy when it comes to, let's say, a form, but when a company has to do it for every process, every department, every product that they have, going back to the drawing board and then building it in is, as you can imagine, it's a humongous task.
So thanks a lot, Shivangi, for sharing your insights with all of us today, and many more who would be sort of watching this session online subsequently on YouTube and other platforms that Kurtz would be putting up on. So my take on this whole discussion is like this: that yes, there'll be car companies that they'll be putting up seat belts, and yes, there may be regulation that okay, you should use helmets, etc. And there would be road signs on the roads. There'll be red lights and other things to manage the traffic. But at the same time, the onus is also equally on the users also, both ways, not only in terms of protecting ourselves, but also protecting others around us. So, for example, when you are driving, not only you have to drive carefully that you do not get hurt, but you also have to ensure that you do not hurt somebody else, whether a pedestrian or somebody else some other vehicle or even infrastructure for that matter on the road. Uh, Similar type of thing applies even in case of healthcare. Yes, there will be doctors, there will be hospitals, but at the same time, what is that we can do ourselves to improve our own health and well-being, as the Honorable Finance Minister also mentioned in the budget this time, by including the drinking water and sanitation, etc., as part of the health and well-being header in that sense. That if because that again something becomes more of a preventive care, and as the old saying goes, prevention is better than cure. So here is the other one that I would just end with: a stitch in time, save nine. So over to Amrul. Thanks.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so much.
Mr.
Thank you.
Maheshwari, and thank you, Shivangi, for your valued thoughts and sharing your experience and advice with consumers on the digital space. I think for cuts, we clearly have few takeaways. First is, while the digital economy continues to grow at a breakneck speed, the awareness generation capacity building initiatives will also need to continue, and we can promise on behalf of cuts that we will do the needful and take this to consumers and consumer organizations, many of whom are participating in this webinar. And not only we'll do this in English, but in Hindi and other languages, so that we are able to actually democratize the need for security and what steps consumers can take to ensure that they safely use digital technology. The second thing is that you also talked about privacy as a competition differentiator, and that is something that is an area that we are also keenly following and working, and we will continue our efforts to promote privacy as a competition differentiator and ensure greater accountability and transparency from service providers. And third, last and not the least, last but not the least, we will continue to push for optimal regulatory and regulatory measures within the regulatory frameworks which are evolving in terms of personal and non-personal data and others to push for consumer welfare and give and ensuring that power lies with consumers. So with that, thank you very much, Shivangi and Deepakji, and we look forward to continuing this conversation offline. And
Thank you,
thank you to the
Aditya, for
participants
inviting
who,
me.
who took out their time to participate and listen to this conversation. Thank you.